Looks like the meeting's going. So anyway, okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. This is basically a webinar that I decided to hold because I get a lot of questions about like the Nikon Z and why would I want to use a tracker versus a star stacking and things like that. So we're going to kind of cover a bunch of that stuff. All right. So let's get on with it. Like I said, welcome everybody. It's a little eye candy for you here. This is a couple shots of the Nikon Z7. These are both taken here in Maine, and you can come here if you want to join me on a workshop and take photos such as this. So, like I said, this is going to be about sort of my thoughts on the Z system. I have that mini review up on my website that a lot of you have probably read or at least aware of. But this is going to cover my thoughts on the lenses, and we're actually going to do a little bit of, I have some sample images that are like 100% crops, so you can see the performance of the 35 and 50 millimeter lenses at f1.8 at night with the stars. And at the, we'll also talk about star stacking versus star tracking. I'll cover those briefly if you don't even know what those are, and then discuss why I don't really have a star tracker for landscape astrophotography. We'll touch on foreground stacking, which is a technique that's really handy for this type of photography. Then I'll discuss my workshops. I'm going to ask you guys where you would like to have workshops, if at all, and my new video tutorial. And at the end, we'll have Q&A for anything. So as we go along, feel free to write down your questions for notes, or type them into the chat box here, and the lovely Linda, my business assistant and girlfriend, is over here. She's taking down the notes for me, and we'll cover questions at the end of this video. Actually, before we get into anything of those topics, I am going on a road trip again, and this Friday I'm leaving for Texas, Big Bend National Park, over to the Grand Canyon, on my way to San Diego, and kind of any place in between there. If you guys have any good tips for Big Bend or anything else in Texas, the Grand Canyon, things like that, feel free to let me know. Or if you've got a photography club in the areas down there that has a last minute opening for a speaker or something, feel free to let me know. So here we are at Nikon Z Mirrorless. So this is not a sales pitch, even though I have some dealings with Nikon. I'm not a Nikon ambassador. I'm not a Nikon salesperson or anything like that. This is holding this webinar about this stuff because I get constantly asked about it, and I thought it would be nice to go into a little more detail on a webinar. So these are my thoughts after using it for a while. Hey, oh, whoops, ended up at the wrong end of the slideshow there. So first of all, if you guys aren't familiar with it, although I assume you are if you're on this call, mirrorless full frame cameras, that's what these guys are. The Z7 and the Z6 are the two cameras. They're essentially the same camera, except for the Z6 has fewer megapixels and it has a different ISO range. The Z7 is essentially a D850 without a mirror. There's obviously a little more to it than that, but for me, this is like all I need to know. All right, hold on here. So I guess, I don't know, we'll just have to go on. The people who can't hear, it is being recorded, and you can hopefully play it later. So the Z6 is basically just a lower resolution. It has a few different features for video, I think, is like that. The sensor on the Z7 performs very similar to the sensor on the D850. The Z6, I've been told it should perform better than the D750. It's a newer camera, newer sensor, but I don't have a D750 to test. Obviously, the D850 is a little older than the Z7, but I don't think they did too much in the meantime to change much on the sensor. They did some redesign for the autofocus and stuff like that, but It is otherwise a very similar sensor, and the image quality performance is about the same as the D850 versus Z7. So is the Z6 better in low light? I get asked that question a lot. For a single shot, yeah, I mean, the theory is that with fewer megapixels, the photo sites are larger, meaning that they collect more light per image. So if you think of how light works, it's basically photons are the particles that make up light. They hit the sensor, and if you have a larger area to collect light, then you'll have more signal there and less noise. So if the photo sites are a little larger or considerably larger on the lower megapixel camera, then in theory, your final image will have less noise than the higher megapixel version. So I guess that's true for, a single shot, but if you take a Z7 photo and scale it down to a Z6 photo, I really have a hard time finding a difference in noise. You're kind of averaging out the slightly noisier photo and then going down to a slightly smaller photo. And but the Z6 is, cheaper. It's if you just do single shots, if you're not doing star stacking, not doing very long exposures, that could help you with noise. For panoramas in particular, I often just do a single shot per frame as I stitch together the panorama instead of doing star stacking, just because it would be a very long process. But in general, I'm doing star stacking and very long foreground exposures or stacking foreground exposures. This all reduces noise. And in general, I'm totally fine with a high megapixel camera for night photography and have no issue with it. I also get asked about the Sony cameras a lot. I don't have a Sony camera. I have an A6000 sitting in a box or a bag somewhere I haven't used in years. The newer Sonys, they come through my workshops quite often, and they perform very well. I mean, they're just any camera. The Canons all perform very well too. So if you're thinking about switching, like, it just comes down to your own budget, your own personal preference, how much you're willing to spend on like dumping all your glass for something else. If you're looking for another camera and you already have Nikon glass, I just stick with Nikon or dump everything and go to another brand. But they're all perform very well. I see just about everything come from my workshops, and I don't really, just pick whatever you like. Certainly, I'm very happy with the Nikon and the Z7 for just about everything I do. So back over to the slideshow. Just a random note, just note that throughout the slideshow, you'll see the name is Z space 7 because that's the official name. I don't know why they decided to put a space after the Z in the marketing name, but that's what it actually is called. So the Z space 7, Z space 6. This is just an example of the difference in megapixels size. Obviously, the sensors are the same size, but the output image on the Z6, that's how big it will be in comparison to the Z7 image. So even though the numbers sound almost twice the difference, the Z6 is not a postage stamp in comparison to the Z7 by any means. It's still a very good camera, very high resolution, and I have plenty of photos taken with a D5 and even older cameras or even low resolution cameras. I would have no trouble printing 10 feet high. So I'm not too worried about the megapixels, especially for night photography. Dealing with a lot of noise anyway, but you can certainly take steps to reduce that with the star stacking and whatnot. We'll talk about a little later. So if it's not in your budget to get the more expensive camera, go with the Z6 or the D750 or the D600 or whatever they got now, D650, D610, something like that. So why do I like the Z7? It's really just two main reasons. It's lightweight and smaller, which is great for hiking or just in general, carrying around your camera. And it's the same image quality as a D850. That's really all I need to know. There's no real limitations to it. It's basically a D850 without a mirror, and it's smaller. And the newer lenses have benefits as well that we'll get into. But, if you have a D850 and you're thinking about going mirrorless, if you do a lot of hiking, if you just want less weight, I think it works well for that. I don't really see, there's no difference in image quality. So, if you don't really care about the weight, then there's really not a big deal to upgrade right now. They will have the newer lenses or the old lenses, the NIKKOR F-mount lenses will continue to be made for the foreseeable future. I don't see there being any phasing out of the DSLRs anytime soon, that's for sure. The biggest benefit beyond weight and size is the lenses. Skip ahead there a second. The lenses are just higher quality optics because, well, the better quality optical designs because of the shorter flange distance. We'll get into that in a little second, a minute here. So this is comparison of, on the left, you see my D850 and my normal go-to lens, the 24-70 f2.8. And in the middle, we have my new go-to, well, my go-to lens for daytime landscapes, I should say. At night, I'm obviously using the 14-24, which I certainly use during the daytime as well. But now in the middle here, we've got the Z7 and the 24-70 f4. So you can see just by the sheer size that it's much smaller. And the thing on the right there, that's the 50mm f1.8 S lens, which is the new Z lens. And you can see that 50mm lens is basically the same size as the 24-70 f4 lens when it's collapsed. The 24-70 f4 zooms and expands a bit, so it's a little bit bigger when you're actually using it. But that's the size that we're talking about here. And if you hold these in your hand, I mean, there's a huge difference in weight. So it's all about, for me, it's all about weight and size and the better optics, which is probably talked about endlessly online. So I'm hoping I'm not boring you guys here, but that's why that's why I'm happy with the new mirrorless cameras. And if you ask me why I like them, well, this is why. What about the issues that you probably heard about plenty of times? Single flash card. Well, I haven't thought about it since I started using the Z7 last summer. Obviously, that was a big issue when the thing came out and it was all over the internet. What about, there's only one flash card. What happens if one dies? I just haven't had an issue. What are they called now? I don't even remember the name of the cards, but the XQD cards, I think is what they are. So, yeah, the XQD cards are really reliable. Haven't really thought about it. For battery life, I honestly don't notice any difference at all between this and the D850 because of the way I shoot. And the D850 for landscapes, I'm already using live view all the time. And so using a mirrorless camera is essentially live view all the time. I don't notice any difference in battery life for the way I shoot. And then at night, even if I'm not using live view, I'm using lots of exposures, lots of very long exposures. So again, I don't notice any difference. And at night, you can disable the display so that when you don't have your eye up to the viewfinder, it's not turning on the back display either. There's a mode in there. If you cycle through the different display modes, there's the auto switch. So if you put your eye up to the viewfinder, it'll switch over to the viewfinder. If you take your eye away from the viewfinder, it'll switch to back display. You can change that by going to the mode that's just the viewfinder so that it doesn't light up the back of the screen, and you can still hit the info button or the display button to get the back panel to light up with the settings, your camera settings, and playback buttons. You can actually see the photos you took. So that's what I do at night, is I usually turn off live view on the back screen. And there's no point in using live view at night unless you're focusing because you can't see anything. If you're focusing for the stars or using a flashlight to focus, then obviously you can use live view to see, but otherwise just turn live view off at night so you can save battery life. A few other things in the chat room here. I see that you don't have to record it yourself. I'm recording it here, in theory anyway. I see a little record light blinking, so hopefully after I'm done with this webinar, it'll save out a video file and then I can email it out to everyone on the mailing list. So speaking of which, thank you all for coming. Kind of jumped into this quickly because of the technical issues I had, but I really appreciate everyone coming to this webinar. You guys are the reasons that, I'm able to have a business doing photography, people that support me and all that. So thank you very much for coming. Okay, so obviously all those notes about what I said about the Z, but remember, this is just my thoughts as it pertains to landscape photography. I don't shoot I really don't shoot much anything other than landscapes, the occasional wildlife shot, and I rarely shoot video. Yeah, thanks, man. I got 100 participants here. How about that? Well, that includes me and my girlfriend, but that's okay. So that's like 98. So is the Z7 weatherproof? It's weather sealed. I think it's very similar to the D850. I don't know. To be honest, I don't know the exact details of it, but I can tell you I've had it in the rain quite a few times and I haven't had any issues. If it's raining hard or you're going to be out in wet weather for a long time, even if it's just kind of damp, it's generally a good idea to have some sort of bag on your camera. There's a lot of plastic bags you see that people use or something like that. And if it's really raining hard, you're probably going to have a hard time taking any photos because it'll be raining on your lens. So but generally, if I'm at a waterfall or it's raining lightly and I'm getting misted, I don't have any issues. So those are my thoughts there. A couple important notes on using the Z7 that are different than the full frame cameras. An L bracket. I use an L bracket for vertical use, or it's just easily changing from horizontal to vertical on a tripod that has a Arca Swiss type quick release head. It's pretty common. Most photographers I see have an L bracket. I use in Really Right Stuff 2-part L bracket on the Zs. I'll explain why in a second, but there are cheaper options available. You need a sliding L bracket or a sliding L bracket for these. Oh boy, here we go again, jumping ahead. Sorry, folks. I can't have the slide show up in the way I was expecting to, so I'm hitting the wrong buttons once in a while. All right, so you can see this thing coming off the side of the camera here. That's my Really Right Stuff 2-part L bracket. It lets you put the camera in your tripod mount, well, as it's sort of shown here with the L bracket coming out the side, and it's right now clamped horizontally. You can see on the left side of this image, there's that cable coming out, and that is the little, I think it's called DC2 USB cable, or I don't know, maybe it's not USB, but it's DC2 style cable that is used for the remote port control for intervalometer bulb mode. So instead of like the full frame cameras or like the pro level full frame cameras like the D850, the D5, et cetera, that have the 10-pin connector on the front of the body, it's on the side. And this is exactly the same connection and similar in style that anyone in here that has the D750 or the D6 7100 or any of those cameras that are not quite considered, I guess, what Nikon might call the pro grade. Any of the crop cameras for sure. And I think maybe the D600 series, D750, same thing. You have your remote port as a little port on the side. The real pain in the butt with that is that if you want to vertically mount it and use that port, you've got to mount it to the side like this, and you've got to have a sliding L bracket that comes past that port a little ways, so that one, you can open the port easily, and two, you can get that remote cable in there and get it off to the side and have the camera shifted up a bit from the tripod head enough so that depending on the type of tripod clamp you're using, I'm using this Really Right Stuff BH55 clamp head. So the clamp comes over to the right like that, and it's going to hit that port connection if it's down too far, if the camera is down closer to the head. So you can see there's a gap between the bottom of the L bracket and where the camera body is. And you have to put it off to the side like this. This is absolutely the same exact problem you would have in a D750 or any other cameras like that. So this is not new. It's just something to be aware of if you're switching from a camera that's always had the 10-pin to this. And it's, I've had no issues with it. It is a kind of a pain and I don't like it, but it works. And now I'm used to it. Someone is asking if mirrorless cameras have the issue with light leakage through the viewfinder on long daylight exposures. There's a mirrorless camera, there's no optical viewfinder at all. There's no other way for light to get into the camera other than the lens. So no, you don't need to worry about any of that stuff. I'm going to keep going on with most of the slideshow here, and Linda's going to copy these questions down, and we'll get back to them a little later in the show. So a little eye candy again here. This is the during last summer, last August, I had the Z7. It was a secret copy. It was before Nikon had even announced it. It was a really special thing for me to be part of this. Nikon invited, I think it was about 12 or, was it 12 or 20 of us? I think it was 12 of us that might have been in the room. Photographers in the U.S. to their headquarters in Melville, New York, Long Island. And we really had no idea why we were going there. So, I mean, we guessed it was because they wanted to give us the new mirrorless camera to play with, but they wouldn't really tell us why we were going there. We just knew we had to show up. So we got there, and after a long delay of just sort of sitting there in mystery, we finally got to go see the camera, and then we got to have the cameras to go home with. So we all got a Z7, and I just got the Z7 and the FTZ adapter to play with. And anyways, I got to play with that for about 3 weeks in the summer before it was even announced to anyone. And it was a pretty great experience. And I had to go out alone, so no one else would know I was using a Z7. So anyway, this is from that experience last summer right here in Lubec, Maine. This is like all my shots that you've probably seen. It is a star stacked for the sky of 10 shots, 10 seconds each, ISO 6400, f2.8 on the Nikon 14-24 lens at 14 millimeters. The foreground is 3 shots. They're all at f2.8 and ISO 1600. 2 are at 10 minutes, one's at 20 minutes, and one of the 10-minute shots was pulled in for focus stacking, meaning I focused on the closer part of the foreground for a separate shot so that I could blend all those shots together to get an image that appears in focus from the stars to the closest foreground object. And those 10 and 20-minute exposures at ISO 1600, they're that long so that I have low noise. That's something I'm not going to cover in detail in this webinar, but ISO invariance, if you guys aren't familiar with it, go look up ISO invariance. It's basically the fact that most modern digital cameras these days, the ISO that you shoot at doesn't matter that much. It doesn't add that much noise to the image. It has to do with the way the sensors work and the way the amplification happens after reading the photons that hit the sensor, the signal. But essentially, you could shoot your sky shots at 6400 or ISO like 1600, and you could boost the 1600 and post to brighten it, and it would be about the same. Like, there's not a big difference in noise. And you could similarly shoot it at 12,800 and get the same results. But the thing to keep in mind is the higher you go in ISO, the more you're going to blow out very bright stars. So I tend to shoot at a lower ISO than people might think sometimes for the stars. I have a friend who calls the ISO, when he's talking about night photography, he calls the ISO the blown out stars control. So you turn the blown out stars control up or down, and that's your ISO. So a lot more detail on that can be gotten into maybe on another webinar, or come to a workshop, or read my free ebook online, although that doesn't cover the ISO invariance and star stacking in any sort of great detail. But if you have more questions about that, feel free to type in the chat room and I can hit them up later in the show. Okay, up next here. So the lenses. Okay, so that mini that mini review on my website about the Nikon Z7 is just about the camera and the FTZ adapter. I didn't have any of the lenses. They gave some lenses during this trial period, or this sort of, whatever you want to call it, pre-release fun show to some of the photographers. I just got the FTZ adapter because they wanted me to use that with the 14-24 and take night shots. So that's what I got to use, and that's what the review on my website is based on, is just the Nikon Z7 and the FTZ. So since October, though, I've had most of the new lenses. I have the 24-70 f4, the 35 1.8, and the 50 1.8. And these are all great lenses, and the 24-70, I really love it because it's so light, it's sharp. I mean, there's really no downsides to it other than the fact that it's an f4. Not that I do a lot of night photography in the 24-70 range anyways, and if I would, I'd be using the 35 or 50 that are f1.8s. It's coming soon. You guys might have seen it. There's an announcement of the Nikon Z 14-30 f4. I'm excited about that. lens, and obviously very excited about the Z 58mm f.95 knocked. That's right, you read it correctly there. It's not a typo. It is an f.95. They're making this crazy lens. I'm sure it'll cost, you know, $500,000, but it'll be really interesting to test it out and see if the new optical designs that they're able to do actually work for this, because they're claiming that they can get basically no coma distortion or very little coma distortion on these lenses. And they're 35 and 50 are very well controlled. They're certainly not known. They're not absolutely none for coma distortion, but they're very well controlled. So I'll be very curious to see what this 50 f.95 does. But that's a ways down the road, I think. The 14 to 30 is coming soon. So what's the big deal about these new lenses? So the real thing, the mirrorless that they did, that's not just lighter weight and smaller. They are able to make the flange distance shorter, and that's the distance between basically the rear element of the lens and the sensor. By getting rid of the mirror, you don't have that chamber in the way. You can put the rear element of the lens closer to the sensor. And this is good for optical designs. I'm not an optical design engineer, but basically it lets them create better lenses that handle distortion better. They're sharp, apparently, across the entire frame without stopping down. I have very good experience with this. I haven't tested it like crazily. I haven't taken f1.8 and f2 and f2.2 or whatever and compared them all together on a sort of a focus chart or something like that, or a brick wall. But I've taken images at f1.8 and taken images at other f-stops here and there and kind of compared them. And yeah, I mean, the things are sharp like crazy. So really, really good lenses. They still have a bit of vignetting from what I've seen, but that's not a big deal. Let's see, the FTZ adapter, this literally works just as if you were using F-mount camera. The FTZ adapter is that thing in the middle between the lens and the camera there that has the sort of slide and the white dot on it. And it lets you use F-mount lenses on the Z cameras. I literally have no issues with this at all. It's exactly, in my experience, like using for example, in this photo is the Nikon 14 to 24 F-mount lens. It's exactly like using it on a D850. Like I haven't had any issues with it at all. The only cumbersome thing is that you have this extra adapter you have to deal with. So if you want to switch between a Z-mount lens and an F-mount lens, you got to take the FTZ adapter off. And if you've got the FTZ adapter, like I usually leave it on some lens in my bag, but if I want to switch from a Z-mount lens to some F-mount lens and the FTZ mount adapter is not on that lens, it's kind of like a three-way lens show of you know, three-card Monte type thing, trying to get everything together. But if you buy a bunch of FTZ adapters, you wouldn't have that issue, I suppose, on each lens, but they're not cheap. But otherwise, it works very well. Really no issues there for image quality. This is just a little bit about that new Nikon, the 14 to 30 f4 that's coming. So why am I excited about an f4 lens? Well, I do shoot in the daytime too, despite all the photos that you might see. It's light and small, just like the 24-70. It can use regular screw-on filters. So unlike the 14 to 24 f2.8 lens, it's got that giant sort of fisheye sort of type front element and the flower petal built-in lens hood. The 14 to 30 has an 82mm filter thread, and so you can use regular screw-on filters. You just have to buy the right size. And of course, it'll take any square filter adapter that fits that as well. F4, obviously not super great at night, but if this lens is really good at coma control, like the coma distortion isn't bad in the corners, maybe it's even better than the 14 to 24 lens, which honestly at this point, 14 to 24 is a little old, so it has some coma issues. But it's still a great lens. But if this one's really good in the corners, I mean, you could still use it at night, just do star stacking and, you know, very long foreground exposures, even longer than what I do now, or foreground stacking, which also need to be longer than what I would do now. But basically, you know, you'd have to double everything, right? You know, from f2.8 to f4, you're losing a stop of light, so you might have to take 20 or 30 sky shots for star stacking instead of 10 or 20. That said, you know, if I ever get my hands on it, maybe I'll try it for that and you know, we'll see. I could see using this lens at night on a hike where I don't want to carry the weight of that 14 to 24, because that 14 to 24 is a big heavy beast. And if I can get my backpack weight down, then have just this lens and maybe the 24-70 for both day and night landscapes, I mean, that would be great. So, you know, it sounds kind of crazy to use an f4 lens at night, but it might work. All right, so these are some samples of the 50 millimeter f1.8 lens, and I have samples of 35 f1.8 as well coming up next. As you can see, this is basically straight out of camera. I haven't brightened or done anything to the image other than white balance. This was taken outside my house in downtown Lubeck, which, even though it's a small town, small village, it does have plenty of light pollution right downtown. So that's why the sky is kind of washed out like that. But it's a good enough image to see the coma distortion on the stars here. So once I fixed the vignetting very easily in Lightroom, you can see it's, well, you know, it looks good. Got rid of the vignetting. It's a pretty even image. This is a 100% cropped zoom. That means zoomed in to 100%, and then I've just cropped out a piece of the image. And this is the center of the frame. And you can see the stars are essentially little round spots, like almost perfectly round. They're slightly elongated because this was a 5-second shot at 50 millimeters. And if you want to have true pinpoint round stars, you've got to do about 3 seconds at the maximum, which is what I would probably normally do, but I was just kind of testing it. So very good in the middle. How does it do in the corner? Well, this is the corner. And this is, again, 100% crop in the corner. And you can see that there is definitely coma flare. You know, these little stars all have kind of like wings on them a little bit, some worse than others. Some of the big bright stars, like, and you can see in the upper right corner there, are like really flaring. But for a 50 millimeter lens, this at f1.8, this is really amazing. My 50 millimeter lens that I had before this was the Sigma f1.4 50 millimeter art lens. For you guys out there that are familiar with those Sigma glass, it's Sigma's high-end glass designed to be basically compete with any other pro grade lens. Well, let's compare this corner on the Nikon Z 50 1.8 wide open at 1.8 to the Sigma 50 1.4. This is the corner from the Sigma F50 1.4, wide open at 1.4, and you can see just what a friggin' crazy coma show this is here. All the stars look like they're angels or something, just tons and tons of flare. And this is not only appearing in the corner on this lens, it goes from the corner to around the edges into the center of the lens, not in the dead center, but around the edges, sort of the mid-center maybe. So on the Sigma F50 lens, if you guys have it, you want to get rid of that coma, you're going to have to stop it down to, I think f2.2 is where I was with it when I used it. So you're paying all this money for like this nice f1.4 lens, and you can only use it at like f2.2 or so if you want to have reasonable coma control. I mean, I've shot with it at f1.4 and edited photos like that, but you know, as you can see, quite a bit of coma distortion there. So again, here's the Nikon 50 f1.8 Z lens, very good control there. So here we are, this is the 35, Nikon Z35 lens. I already, like I said, like this is like the other one, white balance, and I corrected the vignetting. And center of the lens, obviously, very good, nice round stars. Edge of the lens, very similar to the 50 millimeter lens, pretty well controlled, but there's definitely coma flare around there, but still very well controlled. There's not giant angel wings flying off everywhere, or UFOs, or you know, whatever you like to call it. So pretty good. And now, why on earth would you want to use a 35 or 50 millimeter lens at night for landscapes? Well, so you can take images like this. This is shot in Acadia, and that's a 50 millimeter. This is back when I had the 50 Sigma. And this is at Boulder Beach, that's Otter Cliffs, and you can punch in and get just really beautiful shots of the Milky Way like this up against some sort of landscape. This is the real image, like, you know, it is a stack and blend, but I didn't fake the Milky Way. I didn't fake the foreground, just like my other images. It was all taken on the same place in the same night. I didn't move the camera or the tripod. The 50 millimeter reach obviously gives you this really nice punch in on the Milky Way, and you get a lot of nice detail. And if you're doing star stacking, you can really clean up that noise really well, and it's just really beautiful. And another example of using a 50mm lens at night with the Milky Way is this guy here, and you can see just how nice that is to get that tight on the galactic center. This is up in New Hampshire a few years ago in the fall. So really fun using the 50mm lenses, 35mm lenses at night, believe it or not. So that green stuff, by the way, over on the left-hand side, that's airglow. That's not light, well, there's orange light pollution, but the green stuff is airglow. It's not color noise. So moving on. All right, a little more eye candy here, just to show you some shots with the new Z cameras. This was with the Z6, and I believe the 35mm lens, and that stuff on the horizon there, believe it or not, that's not lightning. It is lights from lobster boats in Canada. This is taken here in Maine and looking out towards Canadian fishing waters. And these crazy light phenomenon is caused by, it's called diamond dust. It's basically really tiny ice crystals that reflect the light straight up into the sky. So believe it or not, that's what that is. Those are just a bunch of lobster boats out fishing, and they have these ridiculously huge, bright lights on the front of the boat to light up the water in front of them. And that's what happens with all that light that goes straight up into the air with the diamond dust. It's really, really interesting. I'd never seen it like this before. I was out trying to shoot Orion, and I saw some glow on the horizon. I couldn't see the pillars like that in my naked eye. It was too faint, but I could see a glow. So I was like, oh, there must be some guys out fishing. So just pointed the camera in that direction to see what I could get. And I was like, oh my God. So really, really quite stunning. It happens when it's usually has to be very cold, clear, and the dew point has to be reasonably high to make this happen. So this was in the winter. I think this was in either January or December. It was a cold night. It was, I think, maybe 10, 14 degrees, something like that, Fahrenheit. So star stacked image as usual, maybe 10 or 20 shots for the sky. I think there might have been a separate shot for the foreground, or I can't remember. It might have been far enough away I didn't need to do any separate images for the foreground. Same night, just turned around about 90 degrees, and this is looking towards Orion, reflecting in the water that tide was coming in or out at the time. I can't remember, but it was high enough for it to reflect the light a little bit in the shallow cove there. And this is using the LRGB processing method, where you take basically in Photoshop, you would duplicate the original image. You'd have a luminance layer that's just black and white, and then a color layer below it. And you do a bunch of work to these images to really bring out the nebulosity and stuff of Orion. So that's why you can see the sort of faint arc and nebulas up there in the sky. It's through that processing method, which is, guys can look that up if you're interested in it. Lonely Spec, Ian Norman has a great tutorial on doing LRGB processing for the Orion Molecular Cloud Complex, which is the fancy name for all the nebulas around the Orion constellation. Okay, so this is a daytime image taken with the Z7, the FTZ adapter, the 14 to 24 f-mount lens, and a 10-stop Nisi filter. Don't use the 10-stop filters a whole lot, but this was sort of late morning. The clouds looked really nice, and the only way I could get a long shutter speed was to use some sort of ND filter. So I threw that 10-stop on there and a polarizer as well. And I think this is a 30-second shot. This was just a couple weeks ago, I think. And this was just an example of using the Z7 with a very long shot, very long lens. This was taken with the 200 to 500 f5.6 lens, the Nikon lens. I used that plus the FTZ adapter on the Z7 camera. Worked great. No problems at all. You just got to make sure that when you put it on your tripod, you're using the lens mount and not the camera mount. So you want to get some sort of plate for that lens, the foot on that lens mount. You can get like an Arca Swiss style plate to go on that on that collar. I'm trying to think of the right name. I guess it's the lens collar, and that'll go into your quick release clamp. So if you don't have that on there, you're going to have kind of a hard time using big lenses on any camera. So, hey, I don't know why it's giving me trouble. All right, so let's move it on here to star stacking versus tracking. So I get asked a lot, why don't I use a star tracker? And I'll explain what that is in a minute for those of you who aren't familiar. So why would I want to use one or the other or either? Like, what's the deal with these things? Well, why would you even use it? So let's start with a tracker. A star tracker is a piece of equipment, sort of like similar to the one in the photo shown here, that allows you to put your camera on top and track the stars basically by rotating the camera with the rotation of the Earth, so that it can follow the stars through the sky, so you don't get star trails. These range from incredibly cheap and light to hold tiny cameras to crazy expensive to hold giant telescopes. So and they've been around a long time. The smaller, lighter, cheaper ones have been becoming very popular these days because well, they're just available now in the smaller, lighter, cheaper package. And they're really fun for doing deep space stuff, where you want to put a zoom lens on, or even just like a 50mm lens and take a really long shot of Orion or something like that. They basically let you take, you could take a shot an hour long with this thing if it was tuned perfectly with your lens and it didn't do any trailing at all. Certainly the wider the lens, less trailing you'll see, right? So if you have a really zoomy lens, you're gonna need a really stout, heavy duty tracker. But basically it just lets you take really long exposures of the stars. If you're using it for landscapes though, which is sort of a popular thing to do now, is to use one of these sort of cheaper trackers for landscapes, where you, instead of having the camera point up in the sky like that, it's just aimed like you would for a landscape shot. But obviously since this camera is moving, this thing is rotating throughout the shot, your foreground is going to blur. So that adds extra challenge to dealing with the blurry foreground when you're doing blending later. It's also, it's extra gear, it's extra weight to carry around, another battery to deal with, or multiple batteries depending on what it uses. Every time you move the tripod, you have to re-polar align this thing, a star tracker. You have to point it at the North Star, and if you move your tripod, you have to do it again. So every time you change your composition, you got to realign this thing. And if you're in a spot where you can't see the North Star, or you're down south and you can't see the Southern Star, or the area where the Southern Star might be, I think there's actually not a true Southern Star, it's kind of like a general area. But if you can't see it, then you can't polar align very easily, or if at all. You can try using some virtual stuff with your phone, but that's not going to work too well for anything precise. So, half the time I got trees behind me and I can't see the star anyway, the North Star anyway. So, but they are great for deep space objects. So star stacking, not to be confused with star tracking, this is where you take multiple shorter exposures without a tracker and you stack it in software for low noise. So for example, if you're shooting with a 14mm lens on a full frame camera, you might take 10-second shots and do 10 shots or 20 shots or whatever, and you would stack all those shots together in software later. And the reason I chose 10 seconds here is that the whole point of star stacking is to get low noise, but you can also get pinpoint stars if you just shoot with a short enough shutter speed. So 10 seconds on 14mm is pretty good. You'll get pinpoint stars in the middle, and then it might trail a tiny bit out to the edge. So depending on the time of year, depending on which direction you're pointing, and kind of various things like that, you might need to pull the shutter speed back a bit. But if you have photopills, the iOS and Android app, there's actually a little, they call it a pill, a little module in there for calculating shutter speed. And if you use the NPF method, it'll tell you what you should be using for your camera. So I think to get even better pinpoint stars, it might be 7 3/4 seconds on a D850. If any of you have the new exposure blending video I released, it's covered in there in more detail in the second video. So a couple of things going on here. We get lower noise by stacking the shots. And by stacking, I mean you take it in the software, whatever program it might be, lines up all the images so the stars all line up on top of each other. And then it averages the images together. And basically you're averaging out the noise, but you're also essentially getting a single shot that's essentially this very similar to a single shot that might have been 100 seconds long, or whatever the accumulated time of all the shutter speeds was for your images in the stack. So what does that mean? Well, an example here, if you're taking 10 shots, 10 seconds each, you star stack them, your result will be very similar in terms of noise, dynamic range, and detail to a single 100-second shot that might have been done with a star tracker following the stars. So it's not 100% perfect. You know, you might have to boost your ISO a bit to make up for the fact you're doing a shorter exposure. And that gets into more details of ISO and variance I don't want to get dragged down into right now. But basically, you take a shot like that, and you're basically taking a long exposure. You're just closing the shutter between the shot, like in between a few times. That sounds kind of weird, but basically the result is essentially very similar to a single shot of the same shutter speed, of the sum of all the shutter speeds of everything in your stack. So that in itself right there is why I don't use a star tracker most of the time, except for doing deep space stuff. I can get the same image quality. I can do a 100-second shot or a 200-second shot by just star stacking and taking a bunch of shots. I don't have to carry around a star tracker. I don't have to carry around the extra weight and batteries and deal with lining the thing up every time I want to move the tripod. If I just take a bunch of star stacking shots, it's the same, almost exactly this. I mean, it's very similar to using a stars tracker for taking one shot that's 100 seconds long or whatever it may be. So why bother with all that extra weight when you can just do it that way? Here's an example of star stacking. On the left, we have, I hope you guys can see this on the video, the webinar here. I don't know how much detail is being lost across the web with the video compression and all that stuff, but on the left, this is a single 9-second shot at ISO 6400. I think this was with a, maybe it might have been a D850 or D810, I can't remember. But it's 9 seconds using the 14-24 lens f2.8. On the left, or sorry, on the right, is the result of star stacking 10 of those shots. So I basically took 10 shots right in a row at 9 seconds each. I usually do 10, but I think I had a goof my intervalometer and didn't have enough delay or something, and had like a 1 second delay in a camera for the shutter or something like that, and ended up doing 9 seconds. But anyway, this is on the right, the result of star stacking 10 of these shots. And hopefully you guys can see that on the right, there's a huge, huge difference in noise. Like, it's way less noisy. It's got way more detail. It looks way better. So did I mention the star stacking methods? So up here, someone asked about how to do it on PC. Back up here, for a Mac, you've got Star Landscape Stacker. This is the program to use in a Mac. It takes into account the landscape and makes this a whole lot easier. On Windows, there's a program called Sequator. Now, the benefit of Sequator is that it's free, but it's really bizarre. It works, but it's quirky, and getting the highest quality image out of it requires a few extra steps. But it does work, and it's produced like brilliant results for me when I had to test it out, and to teach it at my workshops and things like that. Star Landscape Stacker in the Mac. You can also use Photoshop, but don't. It's a nightmare to do this in Photoshop. If you have trouble using Sequator, then you might try it in Photoshop, but it's a heck of a lot easier to do this with a dedicated program that can understand the difference between your foreground and the stars. And yeah, there's like tons of good YouTube videos out there too. So if you get stuck on one of these things, just go to YouTube. Tons of videos out there, or feel free to email me as well. But YouTube is going to have tons of information on this. Okay, so compared star stacking, star tracker. Star stacking, very similar results to a single very long exposure. The foreground isn't blurry. That's really nice. Someone asked about Deep Sky Stacker. That doesn't know anything about the foreground, so if you try to run it through there, you'll end up with, I don't quite know what the result will be, but you have to separate the foreground from the sky when you're using these stacking programs. And that's why Star Landscape Stacker and Sequator, they're built for that. If you don't separate the foreground from the sky and you try to line up the images, it's going to get all confused because it'll try lining up the trees between the images instead of the stars or whatever, and it'll just end up being a mess. So you have to mask out the foreground when you do the alignment, which is why these programs do it for you, or they help do it for you. So stacking does not result in a blurred landscape unless your trees are moving or something like that. You're taking the shot in the same place. You don't move the camera. You don't move the tripod. There's no star tracker moving the camera. So it lines up the sky separately from the foreground. That's either you do that manually in Photoshop or with one of the star stacking programs. Sequator or Starry Landscape Stacker. It is smart enough to know that there's a sky in the foreground. And so it aligns the sky separately, and then it blends that in with the foreground, which is also stacked through the same program. And you end up with a result image that has no blur in the stars, no blur in the foreground. It's all sort of blended together. But I still usually take a separate shot for the foreground because, 10-second shots, 10-second shots, 100 seconds for the foreground isn't a lot of light. And especially where I shoot most of the time. Maybe at a lighthouse would be okay, but I usually need like minutes upon minutes of light to get a good foreground shot in really dark areas. So I'll generally take separate shots for the foreground and blend them together. Other nice things about star stacking, you don't, like I said, don't have to carry any extra weight and gear. There's no extra setup time. Star tracker, it's a single exposure, so you have less, processing to do later, sort of, except your foreground is blurry with a star tracker. So that's an added challenge for blending. So you kind of, what you gain in maybe less processing in one end, you kind of lose on another end, perhaps. It needs to be polar aligned every time you move the tripod. It's extra heavy gear, extra batteries. But if you're going to do deep space stuff, then yeah, Star Tracker is awesome. So on a similar note, foreground exposure stacking. So foreground exposure stacking is very similar to star stack. I mean, it's basically the same idea, except that the foreground's not moving, so you don't need to align it, and you don't need to use a special program, really. You could do foreground stacking right in Photoshop, but there is a program called Long Exposure Stacker that Ralph Hill has developed, and Ralph Hill is the same guy who brought you Starry Landscape Stacker on the Mac. And it's just a nice program that makes it a little easier to do stacking. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean here. This is not to be confused with foreground focus stacking or exposure blending for a dynamic range. I'm not talking about focus stacking where you're pulling the focus in between shots, and I'm not talking about just taking different shots for dynamic range, like a bright shot, a dark shot, that kind of thing. I'm talking about taking multiple shots and blending them together, averaging them together for low noise. So the final image after stacking should have a very similar image quality as a single shot exposed for the entire accumulated shutter speed of the stacked shot. So again, what that means is, let's say you have a 4-minute shot, just a static single 4-minute shot. If you took 8 shots at 30 seconds each and stacked them, then it would have a very similar result. You'd have to boost the ISO in those 30-second shots to kind of make up for the loss of light there, but the result would be very, very similar as just a single 4-minute shot. So why would you want to do this? Like, what's the point? There's a few situations where this is very useful, and I've done this before, for example, with my lens heater not working, or in this case, a few years ago, I didn't have a lens heater. My hand warmers, like chemical hand warmers, were back in the car. I didn't feel like going to get them, so I took just a bunch of 30-second shots. I would wipe the lens off between shots, take another 30-second shot, and stack those together, and you can get your 4, 8, 20, whatever minute shot just by taking a whole bunch of 30-second shots. So if you have a lens heater, if your lens is fogging up and you can only get 30 seconds or a minute out of it before it fogs up too bad, or even if it's only 10 seconds, just wipe it off, take another shot, and keep going. Another really good use for this type of technique would be if you're at a place like Acadia, for example, and you're at the sand beach there, or somewhere along the coast where the street, the road is right behind you, or there's a bunch of other people around with headlamps, and maybe someone turns a headlamp on by accident. If you're doing really long foreground exposure shots, like an 8-minute shot or 10-minute shot for the foreground, and a car comes by or someone turns on the headlamp, you're ruined, right? Your foreground shot's ruined. So But if you're just taking a bunch of 30-second shots, for example, then you just use the shots that don't have the car lights or the headlamps in them. You just keep taking a bunch of 30-second shots, and then you can stack those later to get your, for, you know, however long you want it to be, and just don't use the shots that are ruined. So instead of having a, you know, standing there for 10 minutes and then your shot's ruined, you can just stand there for however long you want, and it doesn't matter how many cars go by, unless it's crazy busy, of course, and you can't use any shots. But hopefully that makes sense. And so that's a really good technique for places where you have that issue. All right, moving on to workshops. Like I said, if you guys have questions, keep posting them in the comments here, and we'll get to them later on. So Maine Workshops, some of you have been to them. Some of you are probably familiar with them. These are being held this summer here in Lubec, Maine. It's considered the Bold Coast of Maine. It's a couple hours outside of Acadia National Park. Lubec is the easternmost town in the United States. Something to, you know, put on your bucket list, maybe. These workshops are 3 nights long, but they can be 4 or so nights long if you happen to show up a day early and it's good skies. I will often take the workshop group out a day early if people are here and it's good, clear skies that night before the workshop. These are small groups, limited to 6 people per workshop, hands-on personal instruction. You know, there's a small group, everyone gets attention, and they include Photoshop and Lightroom editing sessions. So where the heck is Lubec? So here's the map of Maine, and you can see Lubec with the little arrow there, way up in the easternmost part of the seacoast. And you can see Acadia National Park right there, so it's a couple hours or so from Lubec. So why would you want to come here? Well, we've got the lighthouse. We're famous for that guy. So images like this can, you can take that, like images like this on the workshop, and it's very dark here, as you can see on this map. There's really nothing in the way if you're going, pointing sort of east, southeast, or southwest up until it gets kind of to southwest later in the year. But to the south and southeast, it's very, very dark. You're just basically pointing out over ocean. So really dark skies, very similar to Acadia National Park, you know, just very dark skies, some of the darkest skies on the eastern seacoast up here. This is a shot taken just down the trail from the lighthouse. I kind of hesitate to use this shot anymore for examples because it's back in my blue phase, I guess you could say, when I kind of process things kind of way too blue. Now I know better that the sky isn't like bright blue at night when there's no moon out. But anyway, it's a pretty shot and people like it. So that angle is the same angle that you saw earlier, but just a different photo from a longer ago. So that we go to this spot on the workshop, and there's also beautiful sunsets, sunrises. There's other places to go. There's Campobello Island, part of Canada, right next to us. So this is a nice sunset we had from this one of the workshops last summer. There's boat-filled harbors, so if you're into that stuff, it's all here. And of course, there's lobster, plenty of lobster to go around. So come on up and have some lobster or a lobster roll or some scallops and take some nice pictures. So these are a couple notes here. You have to provide your own transportation and food, except for the 2 lunches. The cost is $19.50 per person, but that includes 3 nights of lodging and 2 lunches during our editing sessions on day 2 and 3. The lodging is basically about a $500-ish value, or yeah, $450-ish value, something like that. So I do have an option here that I haven't been offering before, but you can do a $14.95, and that does not include lodging, which doesn't really save you anything if you're just going to go buy lodging yourself, to be honest. It's going to cost you about the same in total if you need to go buy lodging. But if you have an RV or you want to camp or you have a friend nearby where you can stay cheaply or for free, then you could save money that way. There is a deposit required to save your spot. Newfoundland Workshop, that's coming up this summer. This is a much different type of workshop. It's long, 7 nights, end of May. Again, it's a small group, limited to 6 people. On the Bold Coast, the Maine Workshops, I got plenty of spots available, but on this workshop, we're halfway sold out. 3 spots gone. This, like I said, very different. We're gonna kind of like chase the light and explore a lot of the island. So we're gonna sort of do lodging and planning as we go, but we'll have it, you know, vaguely mapped out. There is certainly plenty of lodging. You don't have to sleep on the ground or in your car if you don't want to. And we'll go sort of chase the light. I've been to Newfoundland, I think, was it 3 times now? So this will be my 4th time. And I spent a total of, I think, about 3 months, 2 or maybe at least 2 months or so there, running around the island photographing it. And there's icebergs. There's the icebergs from Greenland come right by Newfoundland's North Shore in around May and June, maybe early July or so. So this workshop is scheduled during what is normally peak iceberg season at the end of May and into early June. So where is Newfoundland? Here's a little geography quiz for you guys. Can you find it on the map? I'll give you a hint. It's not actually where the name of it is on the map. The actual island of Newfoundland is right there, just north of Nova Scotia. And Newfoundland and Labrador is the actual province, but the mainland is Labrador and the island is Newfoundland. And so the province is obviously both of them together. So it's pretty far north. As you can see, it's not like Iceland far north or anything like that, but we can get really good aurora shows there. This is an aurora show. When I was there for the first time, I got really lucky. There was a KP7 show. It was crazy. Lights above my head and behind me and all around me. And I obviously cannot guarantee any sort of northern light shows up in Newfoundland, but it's far enough north so that even a KP5 storm would probably look pretty good. And if we got really lucky and got a KP7, I mean, it could be bananas like this. And this happens to be taken at an old, it's a replica of a Viking village. Newfoundland is known for one of the only, or I think it's the only confirmed North American area that has, where Vikings have landed and had settlements. So this is a replica of a Viking village. And there's beautiful giant sea cliffs there, such as this. There's this crazy sort of desert landscape called the Tablelands, which is the Earth's mantle pushed up to the surface. A very dark area, very interesting landscape. And obviously worked out here. This workshop is timed so that the shot is also possible during the workshop. And there's the fishing villages and all that Newfoundland is known for, with the little buildings on the sides of rocks and crazy piers and things like that. This is on the Change Islands. We're going to try to visit that. It's between mainland and Fogo Island. We'll try to get over to Fogo Island as well. So a lot of fun, a lot of places to explore up there. And of course, icebergs. Hopefully we'll get lots of iceberg opportunities. We are going to go out on a boat tour for the icebergs. And we'll probably hop on a boat tour for Western Brook Pond, which is a really amazing landlocked fjord with steep cliffs and giant waterfalls. So it should be an amazing, amazing trip. If you're interested in coming, you probably want to know how to get there. Well, you got to fly into Deer Lake or St. John's, which is the capital, but we're going to meet in Deer Lake, and St. John's is all the way on the other side of the island. It's maybe 10 hours or so of a drive, something like that away. I can't remember exactly. Most flights from the US go through Toronto. I think some go through Montreal or Halifax. So you can get there from anywhere in the country. You just have to kind of hop a flight or two. And if you want to drive, you can drive up to Nova Scotia and take the giant car ferry. This thing is crazy. It's like a cruise ship, and it can haul tons of 18-wheelers, giant RVs, cars, you name it. It carries a ton of them in one crossing. It's about a 6-hour crossing. There are cabins you could get if you wanted, your own cabin with a bed and a shower and privacy, or you can just kind of hang out in a lounge area somewhere or get a reserved seat. There's restaurants, there's gift shops, depending on what time you're on the boat, some of the restaurants might not be open all the time, or the gift shop might be closed or whatever. So depending if you're on a day or night crossing, but lots of cool stuff up there. If you're interested in coming, like I said, 7 nights long. The cost per person on this workshop is $24.50 with a deposit required. You have to provide your own transportation, lodging, and food. None of that's included in this workshop, but we will have, I'll be here to help you figure out where we're going to stay and everything like that all along the way. And we will have, some editing sessions along the way as well. So why would you want to come to a workshop, spend all that money, and come stand around with me for 3 days or 7 days or whatever it is? Like, why would you want to do that? Well, you get personal attention from me. You also get a knowledgeable guide for the locations, which is me as well. I've been to these locations a bunch of times. Obviously, the ones in Maine, I live here, so I know it very well. You don't have to go out in the dark alone. This is something that's really big for a lot of people. They don't they want to go out and do astrophotography at remote places, but they don't want to be alone. You know, what if something happens? You'll be surrounded by other people, so everything will be pretty safe. I include Photoshop editing sessions for the ones in Maine. There's up to 8 hours of editing sessions spread out amongst the 2 days. Well, 3 nights, but 2, like, you know, actual days. And it's fun, you know. Most importantly, these workshops are a ton of fun. I've had a blast in every workshop. The ones in this past summer in Maine were just amazing. Everyone was awesome, had a great time. It's just a whole lot of fun. 2020 workshop. So, you know, maybe you don't want to go to one of those places. Where would you like to see me hold a workshop, if, you know, if anywhere at all? So some of my thoughts that I haven't done yet, but, you know, I have some ideas I want to throw out there. Maybe a Maine lighthouse tour along the coast of Maine, hit up some of the sort of iconic spots. Try to schedule that during the new moon so we could do night photography. Nova Scotia, there's hardly any workshops up there, I think. Cape Breton Highlands National Park is absolutely amazing in the fall. Really, really beautiful spot. And it's very quiet. Like, it's just total night and day up there. I can go there in peak colors, just beautiful colors everywhere, and it's like pretty quiet. Big Bend National Park in Texas. Like I said earlier in this video, I'm heading on a road trip starting this Friday, heading out to Big Bend, Grand Canyons, and other spots. So I'm going to check out Big Bend, see how that looks for workshops. It should be good. So I might consider holding workshops there next year. The US Southwest, I get asked a lot about holding workshops out there. Probably wouldn't do Arches or Zion. Those things, they have a lot of rules for workshops in some of these parks out there. Those guys are incredibly oversaturated with workshops as it is, and just saturated with people. So if you really want to do a workshop out in Arches or Zion, just, you know, there's plenty of them already available. But, you know, we could go to places like Goblin Valley. Canyonlands is a little less insane. Death Valley in Nevada is really big. Lots of cool places out there. That doesn't even scratch the surface. The Canadian Rockies, if anyone's interested in that, Banff and Jasper, I've been there once for about 2 weeks. Just amazingly beautiful place. Alaska, also amazingly beautiful. If I did that in the summer, there'd be no night photography, obviously, because it's a little too far north for that. But really beautiful mountains, wildlife. You know, we could fly out to Lake Clark or Katmai or wherever. Could try to do it later in the year to get some northern light shots, like during fall or something like that, when they actually have some darkness. Iceland, I've never been to Iceland, but I get asked about that a lot as well. So hey, if you're interested in workshops at any of these spots, and I put Ireland on there just because it sounds like Iceland, and my girlfriend and I were talking about Ireland recently, so maybe we'll hold a workshop there. So you know, do any of these interest you? Do you have any other ideas? Please put it in the chat box or send me an email. All right, I have a new video tutorial available, as you've probably seen by now. Exposure blending for landscape astrophotography. For those of you that have my workflow video, this covers advanced blending that was not shown in that video. It kind of goes hand in hand with that video, though. It's almost 3 hours long, and it has 6 separate examples of blending sky and foreground exposures. Note that this is not faking it. I use Milky Way and foreground shots from the same exact location on the same night without moving the camera. I'm not taking a Milky Way shot from Arizona and mixing it with a night foreground shot from Maine or whatever. That's not what I do. So you could certainly use these techniques for doing that, though. These are some example images. This is a focus stacked image with helicon focus and exposure blending for the sky as well. So that is shown in the video, how I do that. This is from Vermont. So I show you the sort of the basic blending that's done there, including the pond reflection, which is a little bit more complicated. This was a very challenging shot to blend. So I show you how to deal with, you know, a shot that you might come across like this, where you have trees blowing in the wind, and, you know, what kind of chaos that leads to. A shot like this, where you have trees that aren't blowing in the wind, but they're going up into the horizon, and it's generally a pain in the butt to blend. How do you get a good mask around it? Well, I show you in this video tutorial how you can get like a perfect mask around that, and without any seams. And really ambient bright foreground, well, I cover that from a lighthouse example. Much easier blend, but some tricks in there as well. So all of that stuff, really good content, I hope. I I show you how to combine two masks together for a complete horizon mask. We've got basic blends. We've got really advanced blending with Select and Mask Tool in Photoshop. This is all in Photoshop, by the way. There's just a tiny bit of prepping the images in Lightroom and a few examples, but this is all in Photoshop with one example in Helicon Focus, which is a dedicated focus stacking tool. We cover things like consistent noise texture across the image. So that means not just noise removal, but noise addition, which sounds crazy, but in some cases, removing noise, it just makes the image look too plasticky and weird. So you can actually remove a little bit and then add a little bit in other areas where you can kind of get a consistent noise texture across the image, so it doesn't look like you have like a really smooth foreground, like the water is just like clear and silky, and then the sky is really noisy around the horizon. Like that would look really like a dead giveaway of you know, bad blending or something. So this helps you with some of that. And show you how to remove hot pixels in Photoshop instead of taking your dark frames. You know, it's still easier to do it that way, but you can sometimes remove the hot pixels in Photoshop like pretty easily as well. And I talk about calculating shutter speeds for the sky and foreground, which a lot of people ask me out as well. Like, how do I determine the foreground shutter speed? Because these things are like 5, 10, 20 minutes long. Like, how do you come up with that? So that's talked about in there as well. Here's an example here, you know, foreground, sky, after blending, this is what you get. You know, hopefully a seamlessly sort of looking image with a good blend. These are the exposures that went together into focus stacking, exposure blending for the Lupin's image. You can see how that goes together. So here you go, it's 9 chapters. This is a digital download. There's nothing sent in the mail, no DVDs. You can download it immediately after paying, and it'll be, an email will be sent out as well. Make sure you check your spam folder. And example images are included. They're downscaled a bit to protect my copyright, but they are included, so you can follow along. It's at adamwoodworth.com. There's a preview video there. It's $75, but you get it for $60 with the coupon webinar. And anyone on the mailing list has seen similar coupons as well. And other video tutorials. I have the editing workflow video, my original one that I released a few years ago that covers my entire start to finish workflow minus extensive creative edits and advanced blending. But it goes over star stacking, raw image prep, things like that that are not covered in any of my other videos. There's 2 volumes of create edit videos. The masterclass bundle includes all 4 of these videos, the editing video, the creative edits, and the blending video I just released at a 20% discount of $175, but you can save even more with coupon webinar. Save another 20%. All right, questions and answers, people. What do we got going on? So I'm gonna go over to a document that we're supposed to be sharing here. Okay, I found it. Thank you.
All right. You got them all?
Yep, I think
okay.
so. Cool. Okay. All right, so Audrey asked, what do I think of the Z6? So it's great. Like I said, it's lower resolution, so I would lean towards the Z7 or the D850, et cetera, for the you know, daytime landscapes in particular. And I don't have any issue using the high resolution cameras at night with, you know, star stacking and long exposure foregrounds or foreground stacking, et cetera. Lots of things you can do for that. So I you know, hey, the Z6 is a great camera though, and I wouldn't hesitate to use it at all. And it's certainly in a single shot will have a bit less noise, perceptible noise, but with star stacking and everything, it doesn't really bother me. So let's see. Anton is asking me a question. Let me think about that, Anton. I'll get back to you. This is a little more detailed. Terry and I think Crystal have asked about light pollution filters. You know, Nisi sent me a light pollution, well, it was like a night filter, they called it. It wasn't really I guess sort of a light pollution filter. It's basically a blue filter that just kind of made your image more blue. So I didn't like it. Don't buy the one from Nisi. There are other light pollution filters that actually filter out the wavelength of common city lights. Those would work a lot better because they're actually filtering out hopefully just the light from light pollution and not affecting, you know, the rest of your image. Whereas the ones that are just a blue filter, it's just going to turn your image blue. I haven't used any of them. A lot of them aren't available in big square filters, although I believe Lonely Speck might have a light pollution filter available for square filters now. But, you know, in post, I just bring this orange saturation down if I have a trouble with light pollution. Most of the time, I'm not shooting with much intense light pollution. If I am, it usually is okay with me, and it kind of adds some nice color to the image. Like, you know, as bad as it is, it can actually be an interesting little addition to the image. If you're in an area where there's just light pollution everywhere, you don't have an option, then yeah, maybe look into some of those ones that actually filter out the wavelength of light pollution, but don't get one that just makes your image blue. Like, just kind of, that doesn't really help. I can make it blue in software. Deep Sky Stacker, well, I covered that. When I take 10 shots, the stars would have moved. Yeah, so that's the star stacking. It aligns the images and averages them, and it, you know, it does all the alignment separately from the foreground. So you end up with an image that doesn't have any blur in it. Do I do any post-processing before stacking? Yeah, I prep the images in RAW, so that would be in Lightroom. I would prep the images. With basic raw edits, white balance, lens corrections, you know, things of that nature. All shown in my workflow video, but yeah, you'd want to do your basic lens corrections before taking those images out of Lightroom and into stacking software, because as soon as you get out of RAW, you've lost some leeway in editing. So definitely do your basic editing, especially white balance, lens corrections, maybe basic exposure adjustments and things like that before you do your stacking. Let's see, list of workshop equipment includes a laptop with an iPad Pro and keyboard work okay. I had a client recently who actually had that same setup, an iPad Pro with a keyboard and like an Apple like pen. He had Lightroom Photoshop at the time, which was only like a month ago. The honest to goodness version of Photoshop was not available. So I hear it is coming available, and it's like a full-blown Photoshop. Still, like, that might work, but you know, you wouldn't have access to any star stacking software. Sequator obviously wouldn't run on an iPad, and even Starry Landscape Stacker is a Mac OS application. It wouldn't run on iOS. So, but you know, minus that, if you've got a full-blown version of Photoshop, and if Lightroom works really well, then you could do quite a bit. Hopefully, you could blend the images even together in Photoshop if it was a full-blown version of Photoshop. If you don't have that option, or you don't want to get a laptop, you can still certainly come to the workshop and just take everything in and maybe take notes or something like that. Have you ever been to Cherry Springs State Park? I have not been there, but I have someone who is in one of the photography clubs in Pennsylvania who's talked to me about possibly coming down to that club and maybe doing a workshop at Cherry Springs. I have not been there though, but yeah, it is kind of like a boring, I mean, there's not much for the foreground, but it is dark overhead. Hey, my buddy Marty, any idea what's coming down the road for the Z camera bodies, time exposure ranges? No, all I know about is the Z6 and Z7. They haven't said anything about new Z cameras. If they know, they certainly aren't telling me. So I do not know what's coming down the road there. And yeah, if anyone else has any suggestions for, I don't know, workshop locations, please type it in, send me an email, etc. Feel free to ask any questions here or now. So those are the Q&A questions that I had as the workshop was, or as the webinar was continuing. Anyone else got any questions? I'm here. Maximum amount of exposures for stacking from Robert. So yeah, there is an actual limit on that. You can't just go bananas with it. Too many exposures for star stacking or any sort of stacking, you'll start to get, I think, sensor pattern noise, like sort of fixed pattern noise in a sensor that's always there will show up. It's not something you ever see until you get into stacking, really. There are ways around that with, I don't know if it's the dark frames or light frames, but there are, or bias frames or something, but there are other images you can take that you can feed into Starry Landscape Stacker, maybe Sequator, to tell it to remove the sensor noise like that. Now, what the actual maximum is, I don't remember. I've done 20, haven't had an issue with 20. If you go, but I would try it, you know, hey, go out and take 50 and then stack 50 and then see what happens. If you get some weird results, try 40 and et cetera, 30, 20. You may have issues with, you know, if it's too long, too many focus stacks, or you have too many star exposures in a star stack and the Milky Way has moved quite a bit, then it might have some issues around the edges of the images where the stars are appearing out of nowhere and then disappearing. You know, appearing out of nowhere from the way that things move. You know, stars move across the sky and then disappearing when they move across the frame. So that could be an issue. So, you know, I would say test out and test it and see what works for you. I do 10 shots or 20 shots. I think these days I'm doing more like 20 shots most of the time, and that works really well. Any other questions from anybody? Well, I really appreciate everyone coming, and I hope you guys enjoyed this, my ramble here. I hope it was useful. I hope you learned something. Maybe I'll see some of you here. Maybe I'll see some of you online. Please feel free to email me or contact me on Facebook or something like that. Email is a good way. I get kind of Facebook can get a little filtered sometimes. Oh yeah, discount code. So let me go back up here. So here you go. Webinar discount code for the video tutorials. If you just go to my website, at the bottom of the website on the front page there, you know, you'll see all kinds of the links to all the video tutorials, and there's preview videos. Oh, thanks, Tom. One of the most interesting webinars you've been tuned into. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I just kind of didn't really. A lot of people were asking me about, you know, the Z cameras and star trackers. Like I get asked that a lot. So I was like, well, I'll put a webinar together and then I'll throw in, you know, and other information about my products. Obviously, got to make a living somehow, right? So. Yeah, if you guys have, you know, any other topics, what would you like me to talk about on another one? You know, more about camera reviews, more about technical stuff. Maybe I could have a little, I don't know, sort of mini workshop. You know, I could even do webinars that cost a little bit of money to attend, but are training, right? And we would open the mics and people could talk, things like that. So actually, if anyone wants to talk, I mean, I'm at the end of my yammering. So if I can figure out how to do it here, I can open the mics if anyone has anything to say. Let me see here. Okay, so in theory, if you click on the mic icon, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to talk. And I don't know if anyone has video going, but I can't see the video right now. Training webinars, cool. I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, so if anyone has anything they want to ask or say, feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the box. Again, any suggestions on other webinars, locations for workshops, et cetera, feel free to let me know. And, you know, there's my coupons there. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, I'm hitting the road on Friday. Thanks, David, for the best wishes there. Safe travels. If you have any tips on anything about Big Bend, the Grand Canyon, you know, camping, good spots to go for sunrise or good night spots or whatever, I've certainly been doing my research, but I'm always open to any information you guys might have. I'm going to go on my little RV 20-foot camper van. So if you got any good ideas on, you know, cheap camping or something like that, I don't think there's a lot of BLM around Big Bend. So I think to stay in the campgrounds for the most part. But anyway, thank you for coming, everybody. I will talk to you guys later. Feel free to hit me up on email or whatever. I hope you have a great week.